The Hells Angels biker found the little girl bound in a barn during the storm, and his answer roared louder than wind. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. On a night when the wind howled and the storm raged with a fury that felt like nature itself was in a fight for survival, a lone biker was riding through the thick darkness of the country roads. His Harley Davidson cut through the air with a deep, thunderous roar, like the very storm was trying to chase him down, but he didn't flinch. His name was Jack, but most knew him as Razor, a seasoned Hells Angels biker who had seen it all, fought his battles, and come out stronger. However, that night, the road was leading him somewhere he never expected. As he rounded a sharp bend, the powerful light of his motorcycle illuminated the outlines of an old, dilapidated barn standing ominously against the dark sky. The wind was fierce, but amidst it, he heard something. A faint cry, almost drowned by the wind. It was a child's voice. Jack slowed down, his instincts kicking in as he approached the barn, the sound growing clearer with each second. When he pulled up, his heart skipped a beat. There, in the doorway of the barn, was a little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old. She was bound, her hands tied behind her back, her body trembling in the cold, soaked by the rain that had begun to fall in heavy sheets. The storm was unforgiving, but the sight of the girl in distress was far worse. His first reaction was to drive off, to keep riding, to tell himself that he wasn't the man who should be stopping for a situation like this. But something deep inside made him hesitate. He saw her face, pale and terrified, eyes wide with a mix of fear and pleading. The wind howled louder, but it wasn't louder than the silence in Jack's heart at that moment. Without thinking, he dismounted his bike. His leather jacket creaked as he stepped closer, his boots sinking into the muddy ground with each step. He knelt down beside her, his tough exterior softened by the sight of a child in need. The girl's lips quivered, and she whispered, "Please don't hurt me." The fear in her eyes was too real. Jack paused, taking in the situation. His rough appearance, the tattoos that marked him as a member of one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the country, surely didn't help. She had no reason to trust him. But in that moment, he knew that he wasn't just a biker. He was someone who could help. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jack said, his voice rough but surprisingly gentle. He quickly untied the ropes, his hands working with the precision of someone who had lived through enough dangerous situations to know how to handle them. As he freed her, she looked up at him with a mixture of confusion and trust. She wasn't sure whether to believe him or not. Her body shook violently from the cold, and her clothes were soaked through. Jack knew he had to act fast. He wrapped his jacket around her, lifting her into his arms as she let out a soft cry of relief. "I've got you. You're safe now," he whispered, even though the storm still raged around them. Jack's heart raced as he carried the girl to his motorcycle. He wasn't sure who had left her there or why, but he knew he couldn't leave her behind. The sound of the wind drowned out everything else, but something told him this was the beginning of a journey he hadn't expected to take that night. As Jack sped down the muddy road, the girl clung to him, shivering. The storm was far from over, but the road ahead felt like a strange kind of redemption. The storm continued to howl as Jack sped down the winding country road, his mind racing faster than his Harley could push forward. The girl, wrapped tightly in his jacket, clung to him for warmth, her small body trembling from the cold and the shock. Jack had been through a lot in his life, but this was different. He had always been the tough guy, the one who took care of his own problems and never relied on anyone. But this little girl, so fragile and vulnerable, had shattered that wall he had built around himself. He glanced over at her as they rode through the storm, her wide eyes staring up at him in disbelief, as if trying to comprehend why he had stopped for her. The wind lashed at them, but it seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He couldn't help but think about how her small hands had gripped him when he carried her, how she had trusted him, a stranger, in a way that was so pure and unguarded. He'd never seen anything like it. She had been bound, left to freeze in that barn, and yet there she was, looking to him for help, not afraid of his past or his reputation. In a way, she had made him feel like a protector again. The thought hit him hard. He had not felt like a protector in years. Not since the day he left his own daughter behind when he joined the Hells Angels. He hadn't even been there when she needed him most. His mind wandered back to those days, the days when everything had been about the club, about the rides, about the chaos and the violence. But now, holding this little girl in his arms, those days felt so far away. He had been running for so long, from his past, from his mistakes, from the man he used to be. But as the miles stretched on, something began to shift in him. He wasn't just running anymore. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone to look after. They had been through hell together, and he had sworn to protect her. He looked down at the girl, her brown eyes meeting his as she shivered, and he felt a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. The thought of what had happened to her, of who had done this to her, burned inside him. He wouldn't let it go. No one left her like that. Not on his watch. He pulled into the narrow driveway of his garage, the wheels crunching on the gravel as he came to a stop. The rain had slowed, but the night was still thick with the storm's fury. He gently lifted her off the bike, careful not to hurt her, and carried her inside. The garage was dimly lit, the familiar smell of motor oil and leather filling the air. It was the only place that felt like home anymore. The only place where he could still find a semblance of peace. He laid her down on the old leather couch, covering her with a thick blanket. She looked so small against the worn fabric, her face pale and her hair matted with rain. He found himself pacing, trying to figure out what to do next. She was safe for now, but he had no idea who had left her there or why. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't just move on. But the reality was, he didn't have the answers. He didn't have the right resources, the right connections. But what he did have was a motorcycle and a will to fight. As the silence in the garage settled, he noticed her staring at him, her eyes full of questions. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, her voice cracked, barely audible. "Why did you stop for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack looked at her, the weight of her question heavy on his chest. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He had no answer. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere. He would stay and fight, not just for her, but for the second chance he hadn't realized he needed. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. He was ready to face whatever came next, and he wasn't going to do it alone. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew this. He would protect her, no matter what it took. And whoever had done this to her, whoever had left her in that barn, was going to regret it. This wasn't just some random encounter. This was fate. And fate had a way of pushing you toward the things you needed, even if you didn't realize it yet. Jack took a deep breath, his mind already racing with the plan. He had a lot of work to do, but this was just the beginning. His past wasn't going to define him anymore. He was ready for a new life, one where he could finally be the protector he was meant to be. The garage was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Jack stood over the workbench, his fingers tracing the familiar tools that had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. The girl, still wrapped in his jacket, was now sleeping on the couch, her body curled up in a way that made her seem even smaller than she already was. She had been through so much already, and now she was here, safe for the moment. But Jack knew that her safety was fragile. He knew it wouldn't last forever. His thoughts raced as he looked around the garage. The storm outside was still fierce, but the rain had slowed, and the wind had begun to die down. Jack had always been able to think clearly in the chaos, but tonight was different. He had never felt this kind of responsibility before. He had always been a man of action, someone who did what needed to be done without thinking too much. But now, with the girl in his care, everything had changed. He didn't know what to do next. He had no answers. The questions swirling in his head were endless. Who had done this to her? Why had they left her in that barn? What was he supposed to do now that he had found her? He had never felt so helpless. He walked over to the couch and looked down at the girl. She was still asleep, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. Her face was peaceful now, but Jack knew that peace wouldn't last. He couldn't let it. He had to find out who had hurt her, who had left her to die. He had to make sure it didn't happen again. He had to do something. He stood there for a moment, the weight of the decision heavy on him. He knew what he had to do. He had to find out who had done this and make them pay. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't walk away. He had already made the decision, and there was no going back now. The storm outside had stopped, but the storm inside Jack's mind was just beginning. He grabbed his jacket and slipped it on, the leather cool against his skin. He walked over to his bike, the powerful engine sitting idle in the corner. He ran his fingers over the handlebar, feeling the familiar grip of the machine that had been his constant companion for so many years. He wasn't sure where he was going or what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. He fired up the engine, the roar of the Harley shaking the walls of the garage. He looked back at the girl, still sleeping on the couch, and felt a pang in his chest. He knew that leaving her was the hardest thing he had ever done, but he couldn't let her down. He couldn't let her go through this alone. The road ahead was unclear, but Jack was used to uncertainty. He had spent his life living in the shadows, never knowing what was coming next. But now, for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face whatever came his way. He had a purpose, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him. He rode into the night, the wind in his face and the rain beginning to pick up again. The world around him was dark, but he didn't care. He was focused on one thing, and one thing only: finding the people who had hurt the girl. He didn't know where to start, but he would find a way. He always did. As he rode through the storm, Jack's thoughts raced. He knew that the world had a way of testing people, of pushing them to their limits. But this time, it felt different. This time, the test wasn't just about him. It was about the girl, about making sure that she would never have to face that kind of danger again. The road stretched ahead of him, endless and dark, but Jack wasn't afraid. He had been on dark roads before. He had faced worse than this. And he wasn't going to stop until he had answers, until he found the people who had done this and made them regret it. He wasn't alone anymore, and he wasn't going to let her be alone either. The storm raged on, but Jack was ready to face whatever came next. Jack's Harley roared down the wet road, the wheels biting into the slick pavement as he raced. Through the night, the storm had let up, but the air still hung thick with moisture, and the weight of the decision pressing on his chest felt heavier than ever. His mind was sharp, cutting through the fog of his past and the uncertainty of his future. He had left the girl behind at the garage, trusting that she would be safe. But he wasn't sure how long that would last. He had no choice but to find the answers. He couldn't shake the image of her face, her wide brown eyes filled with fear and confusion. She had been abandoned, left in a barn to die in the cold. Whoever had done that to her, whoever had hurt her, was still out there. Jack didn't know where to start, but he was sure of one thing. He wouldn't rest until he found out who had done this. He had to know why. The thought of her being trapped, alone and terrified, fueled him as he sped down the highway. The road was empty, the kind of silence that made the storm feel like a distant memory. But the silence was also a reminder of how alone he really was. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him back to reality. He reached for it, checking the number. It was an unknown caller. He answered without hesitation. "Hello. You've been looking for answers, haven't you?" The voice on the other end was smooth, but with a cold edge that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. Who is this? Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his muscles tensing. "Let's just say I know who you're looking for. I know what happened to that little girl." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want?" The voice chuckled softly. "I want you to listen carefully, because this is your only warning. Stay out of this. Stay away from the people you're trying to find. Trust me, you don't want to know what they're capable of." Jack's mind raced, but he kept his voice steady. "Who are you?" The line went quiet for a moment before the voice responded. "Someone who has seen enough. Someone who knows what happens to people like you. People who try to play hero." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not playing anything. I'm going to find them. And I'm going to make them pay." The voice on the other end let out a low laugh. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't just about you or her. This is bigger than both of you." Jack felt a chill creep up his spine. He had thought he was just chasing a lead, trying to find out who had hurt the girl. But now, it seemed like he had stumbled into something much darker. "Who is this?" he demanded again, but the voice was already gone. The line went dead. Jack stared at the phone for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence that followed felt deafening. He could feel the weight of the situation closing in on him. He had been warned, but that only made him more determined. He wasn't going to back down now. He wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him. Jack's mind raced as he rode through the night, trying to make sense of the cryptic warning he had just received. It was clear that someone was trying to stop him, but he didn't know who or why. The storm had passed, but the storm inside him was just beginning. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark, but Jack wasn't afraid. He had been down dark roads before. He had fought through worse than this. The question was, who was behind all of this? Who had hurt the girl and why? The questions gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't stop until he had the answers. The girl was depending on him, and he wasn't going to fail her. As he neared the town, Jack felt a sense of urgency building inside him. He had to find the people who were behind this, and he had to do it fast. He had no time to waste. The storm had given him no answers, but it had pushed him to this point. And now, he was ready to face whatever came next. He pulled up in front of a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered weakly in the distance, casting an eerie glow across the dark street. This was where the trail had led him, and he had no intention of turning back now. Jack stepped off the bike, his boots hitting the pavement with a soft thud. He glanced around, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The street was empty, the buildings dark and abandoned, but something about the place felt wrong. He wasn't sure what it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He reached for the handle of the motel door, his hand steady despite the tension that had settled in his chest. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and old carpet. The desk clerk looked up as he entered, his eyes narrowing when he saw Jack. The man's face was rough, weathered by years of hard living. "Can I help you?" he asked gruffly. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the desk, his gaze hardening. "I'm looking for someone. Someone who's been around here." The clerk's eyes flickered for a moment, and Jack caught the shift in his demeanor. He knew something. But what? "You know who I'm talking about," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. The clerk swallowed hard and leaned forward. "I don't know anything," he said, his voice shaking slightly. But Jack could tell he was lying. Jack was getting closer, but he needed to know more. He had a feeling that everything was about to change, and whatever happened next would take him down a path he wasn't prepared for. The clerk's nervous eyes darted to the door as Jack stood over him, his presence filling the small, dimly lit motel lobby. The man had shifted in his seat when Jack had approached, his voice wavering, betraying a level of fear Jack wasn't sure he understood yet. There was something about this place, something off, and the longer he stood here, the more Jack could feel it sinking in his bones. The clerk, realizing he wasn't going to get out of this conversation without answering, finally broke the silence. "Look, I don't know what you want, but you're not going to get it here," he muttered, his voice low. Jack's instincts kicked in. The hesitation in the man's voice, the subtle shift in posture, it all pointed to one thing. This clerk knew more than he was letting on. He leaned forward, his eyes hardening. "I'm not here for a fight. I'm here for information. You're going to give it to me, and then I'll leave you alone. If you don't, well, let's just say it'll be harder for you." The man swallowed hard, his throat visibly constricting. Jack's voice had dropped an octave, deepening the pressure in the room. It was clear the clerk wasn't used to being threatened. "What do you know about the girl? What happened to her?" Jack's words were deliberate, quiet, almost like he was savoring the fear building in the clerk. The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting back and forth, but he seemed to realize that he wasn't going to get away with silence. "I don't know where she came from," he said, his voice cracking. "But people like her, they don't just show up out of nowhere. Someone brought her here. I don't know who, but I know what they did. I saw them come in, 2 men, real shady looking. They were talking about her like she was some kind of job, not a person." Jack's fists clenched at his sides, the weight of the information hitting him harder than expected. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. He had thought the girl was just a victim of circumstance, abandoned and alone, but now he realized there was much more to the story. "Tell me what happened next," Jack urged, his voice controlled but edged with anger. The clerk looked up at Jack for a moment, as if weighing whether he should continue, but eventually, his shoulders slumped. "They took her to that old barn down the road. I saw them dragging her in. She didn't put up a fight, not at first. They locked her in there, told her she was going to learn her place." Jack's blood ran cold at the words. He could almost hear the girl's voice in his head, begging for help, asking for someone to save her from whatever hell those men had put her through. The clerk took a deep breath and continued, his voice growing softer, more strained. I don't know what they wanted with her. They never said, but I heard them talking about a deal. Something about a payoff. I didn't want to know more. I just tried to stay out of it. But when the storm hit, I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I wasn't going to let her freeze in that barn. Jack could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface. He had known that there was a bigger story here, but the idea that this girl had been used as some kind of pawn in a twisted deal made his blood boil. Where did they go after that? Jack asked, his tone now dark with determination. Did you see them leave? The clerk shook his head. No, they just vanished. Left in a hurry. But before they left, one of them said something. He said, the boss will take care of it. Don't worry about the girl anymore. Jack stood still, processing the information. The words echoed in his mind. The boss will take care of it. Who was this boss, and what did they want with the girl? Jack's hand gripped the edge of the desk as he fought to keep his composure. He had to get to the bottom of this. The storm outside might have passed, but this was just the beginning of a new storm that was brewing in Jack's mind. He needed answers. And if the clerk wasn't going to give them to him, Jack was prepared to find them elsewhere. Where is the barn? Jack asked, his voice calm, but with a warning edge. The clerk hesitated, but then pointed toward the window, his fingers shaking slightly. That way, a couple of miles down the road. It's an old farm. You can't miss it. Jack nodded, his mind already racing with the plan. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he was done waiting. Done with the uncertainty. He had a girl to save, and no one, not anyone, was going to stop him. He turned toward the door, but before he left, he paused. If you see anyone else around here asking about her, you tell them to stay the hell away, Jack said, his voice cold and unyielding. The clerk nodded quickly, his fear palpable. Jack didn't wait for a response. He strode out the door, the sound of his boots echoing in the empty motel lobby. The night was still heavy with the remnants of the storm, but Jack's focus had never been sharper. He was going to find out who the boss was, and when he did, there would be no mercy. Jack's tires screeched as he turned onto the narrow dirt road, the headlights of his Harley slicing through the heavy darkness. The barn wasn't far now. He had driven past this stretch of land many times, but tonight, it felt like a different world. The eerie silence that hung in the air, coupled with the lingering memories of the storm, made every shadow seem like a threat. His knuckles were white on the handlebars, his mind racing with every word the clerk had said. The boss will take care of it. Jack's stomach twisted at the thought. Who was this boss? And why did it feel like the storm he had been chasing was only just beginning? The barn came into view, a hulking structure that seemed to have withstood the test of time, but its decrepit state now gave off a feeling of neglect and danger. Jack slowed as he approached, his motorcycle creeping forward with the caution of someone who knew that the unknown could be just behind the next turn. He killed the engine and dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the barn. The air smelled like wet hay and the damp earth that had soaked in the storm. The old wooden doors creaked as Jack pushed them open, the sound echoing through the hollow space. Inside, it was dark, save for the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. The shadows seemed to watch him, but he didn't flinch. The silence was heavy, thick with secrets that were begging to be uncovered. Jack's eyes adjusted to the darkness as he stepped further into the barn, his senses alert to every creak and rustle. He could feel the weight of history here, the ghosts of whatever had taken place in this place pressing against him. The girl had been here, that much was clear. The remnants of her suffering were in the air, in the space between each breath. He could almost hear her voice, her whispered pleas. He moved carefully, his footsteps steady but cautious, his heart pounding as he scanned the area. The barn was filled with old farming tools, abandoned machinery, and piles of hay that had long since lost their golden hue. There was nothing here that looked out of place, nothing that screamed answers. But Jack knew better than to trust what he could see. He wasn't just here to find the girl's past. He was here to find out who had done this to her. And he wasn't leaving until he had those answers. As he made his way to the far corner, his eyes fell on something that didn't belong. A small, metal box, half hidden under a stack of discarded tarps. Jack knelt down and pulled it out, his fingers brushing the rusted surface as he slowly pried it open. Inside was a stack of papers, yellowed with age but still legible. His heart raced as he sifted through the pages, the words seeming to jump out at him. They were contracts, lists of names, and a detailed description of some kind of deal, an exchange. The girl's name appeared several times, along with cryptic references to payment and delivery. Jack's stomach twisted. It wasn't just a random act of cruelty. This was part of something much bigger. He stuffed the papers into his jacket and stood up, the weight of what he had found settling heavily on his shoulders. As he turned to leave, a noise behind him made him freeze. Footsteps. Quick, deliberate. Jack spun around just as the barn doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. He barely had time to react before a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking the only exit. The man was tall, his face obscured by the brim of a worn hat, but Jack could see the cold glint in his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Jack's hand instinctively reached for the knife strapped to his waist, his body tensing for a fight. But the man didn't move, just stood there, his presence suffocating. "Who are you?" Jack demanded. "Who are you working for?" The man chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "I work for the boss," he said, his voice a whisper now, almost like a warning. Jack's grip on his knife tightened. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice sharp. "She's not your problem anymore," the man replied, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. Jack's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He wasn't going to let this man walk away without answers. "Tell me where she is," Jack growled, his patience wearing thin. But the man just smiled, his face twisting into something dark. "You're too late," he said, his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "You don't get to save her." The tension in the barn thickened. Jack knew he was outmatched, but he couldn't let this man intimidate him. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. The man lunged, and Jack reacted without thinking, his knife flashing in the dim light as he stepped to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. The man's weight shifted, and in that split second, Jack drove the blade forward, aiming for the opening in his opponent's defense. The man let out a grunt of pain, staggering back, but Jack didn't stop. He wasn't going to stop until he had answers. He wasn't going to stop until he found the girl and made sure no one else would ever hurt her again. The fight was far from over, but Jack knew one thing for sure. He was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. And nothing, not even this shadowy figure standing before him, was going to keep him from finishing what he had started. The man staggered back, clutching at the wound Jack had inflicted. His face twisted in a grimace of pain, but there was something in his eyes, something cold, calculating, that told Jack this fight was far from over. Jack wasn't about to give him the chance to regroup. He lunged forward, aiming to press the advantage, but the man was quick. He ducked under Jack's reach, moving with a speed that belied his size. In the blink of an eye, he was back on his feet, a wicked grin forming on his bloodied face. "You're gonna regret this," the man hissed, his voice laced with venom. "You don't know what you're messing with." Jack didn't respond, his focus narrowing as he sized up the man. He was bigger than Jack, but that didn't matter. Jack had the edge in the way he fought, in the way he survived. He could see the desperation in the man's movements now. He wasn't just a hired gun. He was scared. Scared of the truth. Scared of what Jack might uncover. Jack was ready. He had been through worse. A quick movement, and Jack ducked under the man's wild swing, using the momentum to spin behind him. With a swift strike, Jack brought the knife down, slashing across the man's back. The man cried out, spinning around in a fury, but Jack was already on the move again, keeping his distance. This was a dance he knew well. "Who are you working for?" Jack barked, his voice rough with anger. The man didn't answer at first, his breathing labored. Jack's patience was wearing thin. He had spent too long chasing shadows and false leads. He needed answers now. "Tell me, damn it," Jack shouted, his eyes burning with determination. The man sneered, but there was a flicker of fear behind his eyes now. "You really think you're going to stop this? You have no idea who you're up against," he spat, his words dripping with venom. Jack's grip tightened on the knife. "Tell me where she is," he demanded again, his voice cold, devoid of mercy. The man let out a low laugh, though it was weak, full of defeat. "You're too late. She's already gone. The boss has plans for her. Bigger plans than you could ever imagine." Jack's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he processed the words. "What do you mean gone? Where is she?" Jack's voice was tight, every muscle in his body screaming for answers. The man took a shaky step back, clutching his side where Jack had slashed him. She's not your problem anymore, the man said, his voice taking on a dark edge. You should have stayed out of it. Jack didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him into the barn wall. Where is she? Jack's fury was unleashed, the frustration, the fear, the desperation all boiling over. Tell me. The man groaned in pain but managed to smirk, his lips curling into a sneer. She's with the boss, and you'll never get to her. Jack shook him violently. I will if it's the last thing I do. Jack growled through gritted teeth. The man's eyes glinted with a mix of defiance and something else, regret, maybe. Or maybe it was a warning. You don't get it. This goes higher than you think. The boss is untouchable. You're just a biker. You can't win against this. Jack could feel the man's words gnawing at him, but he wasn't about to back down now. He had come too far, fought too hard to be stopped by some shadowy figure hiding behind words. He was going to find the boss, and he was going to make him pay. Jack's grip on the man loosened just enough to let him speak again. You'll never make it to him, the man said, his voice hoarse. You're already in too deep. Jack wasn't listening anymore. He turned on his heel, his mind already racing with the next steps. He had to find the boss. He had to save the girl. No more running. No more waiting. The man's voice followed him as he walked away, bleeding and broken. You think you're the hero in this story? You're nothing but a pawn. Jack didn't turn around. He didn't need to hear any more of his taunts. The words stung, but they only made him more determined. He was done being a pawn. He was done being weak. He had a purpose now, and he was going to see it through. The barn doors creaked as Jack stepped outside, the wind biting at his skin. The storm had passed, but the night was far from over. Jack didn't know where the boss was or how he was going to find him, but he had the one thing he needed most now. A plan. He wasn't going to stop. Not until he had the answers. Not until he found the girl. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but Jack didn't care. He wasn't afraid of the storm anymore. He had his sights set on something bigger, and he would do whatever it took to make sure no one else suffered like the girl had. The clock was ticking, and Jack was ready for the next step. Jack's mind raced as he sped down the road, the night wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His hands gripped the handlebars of his Harley, the engine roaring beneath him as he pushed the bike faster, leaving the barn behind in his rear view. The air was thick with tension, each breath he took filled with the weight of the decisions he had made. He had confronted the man in the barn, but the truth was elusive. He still didn't know who the boss was, and time was running out. The thought of the girl, her wide eyes, the fear in her voice, pushed him forward. He had no time to waste. As he reached the edge of the town, the road ahead stretched into the unknown. He knew that whoever was behind all of this, whoever had orchestrated the girl's suffering, was out there. Jack didn't know how he would find them, but he was done playing games. He had no choice but to press on. The next few hours felt like a blur. He didn't stop, not even to check his phone. The only thing that mattered now was finding answers. It wasn't just about the girl anymore. It was about righting the wrongs that had been done, about stopping the cycle of pain and violence that had been set in motion long before he ever crossed paths with her. As he pulled into a small, run-down gas station on the outskirts of town, Jack noticed something strange. A black van was parked in the corner, its windows tinted dark, the engine running as if someone was waiting. Jack's instincts kicked in. He slowed the bike, keeping a careful distance, but his eyes never left the van. He wasn't sure if this was the lead he had been waiting for, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. His hand hovered near his waist, ready to grab the gun he had tucked inside his jacket. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to find the truth. As he approached, a figure stepped out of the van, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat that billowed in the wind. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but Jack could feel the danger in his presence. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice low, almost taunting. Jack didn't flinch. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his tone steady. "Someone who's been involved in some bad business. I need answers." The man chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You think you're the first to come looking? The first to think they can handle this?" Jack's grip tightened around the handlebars, his body tensing. "I don't care about being the first," he said coldly. "I just want to know where she is." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. For a moment, there was silence. Jack took a step closer, narrowing the distance between them. He wasn't going to let this guy play games with him. "Tell me where she is, or I'll make you tell me," Jack warned, his voice low and dangerous. The man's grin faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "You really think you're in control here?" he sneered. "You think you can just waltz in and start demanding answers? You're out of your depth, buddy." Jack's eyes flashed with fury, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not here for a fight," he said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't afraid of one. "I'm here for answers, and I'll do whatever it takes to get them." The man studied him for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "You're not going to like the answers," he said, stepping aside and motioning toward the van. Jack didn't hesitate. He walked toward the van, his senses on high alert. The man followed behind, his footsteps steady but measured. "You're looking for someone who's part of something bigger than you can handle," the man continued, his voice quieter now. "You think this is just about a girl? No, it's about power. Control. There are people who pull the strings, and you're not even on their radar." Jack stopped, his mind spinning as the man's words sank in. "Who are they?" Jack demanded. The man shook his head, a dark smile curling on his lips. "You're already too late," he said. "The boss has plans. You won't stop them. No one does." Jack felt a pang of frustration, but he didn't show it. He was used to being underestimated, to being told no. It only made him more determined. He turned to face the man, his jaw clenched. "Tell me where I can find him," Jack said, his voice cold and firm. The man's eyes flickered with something Jack couldn't quite read. "You really want to go down that road? Fine," he said, pulling something from his jacket. It was a small, folded piece of paper. "You want to find the boss? This is where you start. But be careful. Once you step into their world, there's no turning back." Jack took the paper, his fingers brushing against the man's, and without saying another word, he turned and walked back to his bike. He didn't need to hear anything else. He had the lead he needed. The next move was his. The man's voice followed him as he straddled the Harley, his tone colder than ever. "Remember, you asked for this," the man said. "And once you're in, you'll never be the same." Jack didn't answer. He revved the engine, the roar of the Harley drowning out the man's warning. He had come this far. He wasn't about to stop now. The road ahead was unknown, but Jack wasn't afraid of it. He was ready for whatever came next. And this time, no one was going to stand in his way. Jack's Harley roared down the road, the wind rushing past him as the world blurred into the dark night. His mind was focused solely on the paper the man had given him. The address on it was simple, too simple, and Jack knew it was a trap. But he had no choice. He had to follow this lead. The streets were empty, the occasional streetlight casting long shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. The quiet was unsettling, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The storm had passed, but something about the night felt wrong. He glanced at the paper again. The address was for an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, an area Jack knew all too well. The kind of place that disappeared into the background, unnoticed, forgotten. The kind of place where people went to disappear. Jack had spent enough time in places like this to know they were never good news. He didn't stop, though. Not now. Not when he was so close. As he pulled up to the address, the warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. The building was old, with rusted metal and broken windows, the kind of place that looked abandoned. But Jack knew better. Nothing was ever truly abandoned. He slowed the bike and parked in the shadows, staying out of sight. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his face was stone cold. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. He approached the entrance cautiously, his footsteps silent on the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and the only sound was the faint echo of his own breathing. As he neared the door, he hesitated for a moment, listening. He could hear voices, low, muffled, but definitely there. The voices of men talking, plotting, planning. Jack's stomach tightened. This was it. He had finally found them. He pushed the door open slowly, just enough to peek inside. The interior was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. There were crates stacked up in corners, old machinery that hadn't seen use in years, and at least 5 men standing in the center, talking in low voices. Jack's eyes locked on them, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his side. He knew they were the ones who had hurt her. He knew they were the ones behind it all. But who were they working for? The boss. The one who had orchestrated everything. Jack's eyes narrowed as one of the men turned toward him. The others followed, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Then the silence was broken by a voice. Well, 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 the man said with a grin. Look who decided to join the party. Jack didn't flinch. He stood his ground, eyes never leaving the man's face. Where is she? Jack's voice was low, but the edge in it was clear. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. She's where she belongs. But I think you're here for more than just her, aren't you? Jack didn't answer, but his fists clenched. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to end this. The man took a step forward, his grin widening. You really think you can just walk in here and take what you want? You're in way over your head, biker. You don't know who you're dealing with. Jack's eyes flickered with anger, but he didn't move. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, he said, his voice colder than the air around him. And I'm not leaving without her. The man chuckled, shaking his head. You're a stubborn one, I'll give you that. But that's exactly why you'll fail. He turned to the others, nodding. Take care of him. The men moved swiftly, but Jack was ready. He lunged toward the first man, dodging a punch and driving his knife into the man's side. The man gasped, stumbling back, but Jack didn't give him a chance to recover. He quickly moved to the next, blocking a swing and knocking him off balance before slamming him into the wall. The fight was brutal, fast, and Jack was in his element. He had fought his whole life, but this time, it was personal. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting her, the girl who had been left behind, the girl who needed him. As the last man fell to the ground, Jack stood over him, breathing heavily. The warehouse was silent again, save for the sound of his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. He had taken them down, but he knew the real fight was just beginning. He turned and headed toward the back of the warehouse, where he could see a door leading to a dimly lit hallway. He knew she was behind it. The boss was probably waiting, ready to make his move. Jack didn't care. He was done with waiting. He was done with running. This was it. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, his eyes scanning the area, ready for anything. As he walked down the narrow path, he heard a voice, a soft, familiar voice. Jack, the girl's voice. His heart skipped a beat. I'm here, he called, his voice tight with emotion. I'm coming. He followed the sound of her voice, the weight of everything he had done, everything he had been through, pushing him forward. And then, he saw her. She was sitting against the wall, her hands still bound, but her eyes were wide with relief as she looked at him. You came, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack didn't say anything. He rushed over to her, cutting the ropes that bound her hands. You're safe now, he said, his voice softer than it had been all night. But he knew this was only the beginning. They weren't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. The girl looked up at Jack, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Her hands were free now, the ropes falling to the ground in a heap. She seemed almost fragile, her small frame curled against the wall of the dimly lit room. Jack knelt down in front of her, his breath still coming in short bursts from the fight. His eyes softened as he met hers, the weight of everything he had been through, everything she had been through, sinking in. You're safe now, Jack said, his voice rough but steady. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. The girl nodded, but her lips trembled as if she was still processing everything that had happened. I didn't think anyone would come for me, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I thought I was alone. Jack's chest tightened at her words. He didn't know how to respond, how to comfort her in a way that would make sense of the horrors she had endured. You're not alone, he said softly, his voice full of conviction. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere until you're safe. Her eyes met his again, a flicker of trust starting to form. But Jack knew they weren't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. The fight was far from over. Jack's attention snapped to the sound of footsteps echoing from the hallway. His hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, his body tensing. He wasn't alone anymore, and whoever was coming wasn't someone he was ready to face just yet. The door at the far end of the room creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The man was tall, dressed in a black suit with an air of authority that radiated off him. His eyes were cold, calculating, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and cared for too little. The man paused when he saw Jack, his lips curling into a slight, almost imperceptible smirk. I should have known you'd be here, the man said, his voice smooth and chilling. You really think you can just waltz in and take her? Jack didn't move, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the man. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was the boss, the one who had been pulling the strings. "Where is she?" Jack growled, his voice low with anger. The man raised an eyebrow, almost amused by the question. "She's right where she belongs," the man replied, his tone dismissive. "And you're in way over your head, biker." Jack took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're not in charge here," he said, his voice deadly calm. "I'm taking her with me, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." The man laughed softly, the sound like a knife scraping against stone. "You really think you have the power to stop me?" he asked, taking a slow step toward Jack. "You're just a small player in a much bigger game." Jack didn't flinch. "I'm not playing anymore," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm taking her, and if you get in my way, I'll take you down." The man's eyes flashed with something. Anger, perhaps, but he quickly masked it with a cold smile. "You're brave," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But bravery isn't going to save you here." Jack's eyes flickered to the girl behind him, still sitting on the floor, her hands shaking. The sight of her, vulnerable and broken, pushed him forward. He couldn't back down now. "I'm not leaving without her," Jack said, his voice firm, unyielding. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a hard expression. "Then you'll regret it." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek black pistol. Jack's heart raced, his mind working quickly. He wasn't going to let this man intimidate him. Not now. Not when he was so close. Without thinking, Jack lunged, throwing himself into a roll that took him behind a stack of crates. The gunshot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space, but Jack was already moving. He came up behind the crates, his body low to the ground, and grabbed the nearest metal object he could find, a wrench. He swung it hard at the man, hitting him square in the ribs. The man stumbled back, the gun flying from his hand and skidding across the floor. Jack didn't waste a second. He rushed toward the man, using the wrench like a weapon, slamming it into the man's side. The man grunted in pain but managed to grab Jack by the arm, swinging him into the wall. Jack's head hit the concrete with a sickening thud, but he fought through the dizziness, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until he heard the bones crack. The man howled in pain, releasing Jack's arm. Jack used the moment to his advantage, driving his knee into the man's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. The man fell to the floor, gasping for air, but Jack wasn't done. He grabbed the man by the collar and yanked him up. "Where is she?" Jack demanded again, his voice a low growl. The man's eyes flickered with fear, but he grinned through the pain. "You're too late," he spat. "She's already been taken." Jack's blood ran cold. He knew he wasn't going to get the answers he needed from this man, but he had to try. "Tell me where she is." Jack roared, shaking him violently. The man just laughed, weak and breathless. "You'll never find her. You've already lost." Jack's chest tightened as he looked down at the man, his grip still tight around his collar. This wasn't over. He was closer than ever, but the fight wasn't finished. The boss might have thought he was untouchable, but Jack wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. Jack's grip tightened around the man's collar, the weight of his words sinking deep into his chest. "Tell me where she is," he demanded again, his voice harsh, sharp as a blade. The man on the floor laughed weakly, his breath ragged. "You'll never find her," he spat. "She's already gone. The boss has her now. You're too late." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the man's words echoed in his mind. She was gone. The anger that had been simmering inside him boiled over, and with a violent motion, Jack slammed the man back into the concrete floor. "Don't you dare tell me I'm too late," he growled, the desperation in his voice barely contained. The man groaned, his face twisting in pain, but Jack didn't care. He was done with the games, done with the cryptic answers. This was his last chance, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. "Where is she?" Jack demanded again, his voice low and filled with an unyielding resolve. The man took a deep, pained breath, and for a moment, Jack thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, with a defiant glare, the man spoke, his voice hoarse. "You think you can just waltz in here and make demands? The boss, he's not someone you can take down so easily. You think this is just about her? This is about power, about control. You're playing in a league that you don't understand, biker." Jack's fists clenched, the man's words like daggers in his mind. He had heard enough of this. He wasn't here for power struggles. He wasn't here for games. He was here for one reason: the girl. The man's eyes flickered as Jack raised his hand to strike again, but this time, Jack paused. He had to know where she was. He couldn't afford to lose this moment. Where is she? He asked again, his voice quieter, but filled with a deadly promise. The man let out a low chuckle, but it was tinged with fear. The boss has her, like I said. You won't find her. It's already been arranged. There's nothing you can do. Jack's eyes burned with fury, but there was something in the back of his mind telling him that there had to be more to the story. He wasn't ready to let it. And like this, he needed to know more. He wasn't leaving without answers. The boss, Jack repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Who is he? What does he want with her? The man hesitated, but Jack saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. You don't want to know, the man said, his voice almost pleading now. You don't know what you're up against. Jack took a step closer, lowering his voice. Tell me, he demanded. Now. The man swallowed hard, his face paling. His name is Harland. He's not just some thug, okay? He's got connections, power. He runs things from the shadows. You can't just walk in and take him down. He's untouchable. Jack's mind was racing as the pieces began to fall into place. Harland. This was the person behind everything. The man who had orchestrated the girl's kidnapping. The one who had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. Jack's grip on the man's collar tightened once more. Where is he? He demanded. Tell me where I can find him. The man's lips quivered as he shook his head. You don't get it, he muttered, his voice almost resigned. He's not somewhere you can just go. He's always moving, always watching. His people are everywhere. You won't find him unless he wants you to. Jack didn't back down. Then tell me where to start, he growled. Where do I go next? The man's eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape, but there was none. Jack wasn't letting him go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man spoke. There's a warehouse. Off the grid. No one knows about it. You can't get in without his permission, but it's a place where things happen, where deals are made. Jack's mind locked onto the word warehouse. It was the lead he had been waiting for. His heart hammered in his chest as he pushed the man back to the ground, his mission now clear. You've helped me enough, Jack said coldly. And if you try to warn Harland or anyone else, I'll make sure you regret it. He turned on his heel, his mind already focused on the next step of his journey. He had a lead. He had something to work with. The warehouse was where he had to go next. Jack wasn't sure what he'd find there. But he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop until he found the girl. The man on the ground groaned, but Jack didn't look back. His eyes were set on the road ahead. The storm had passed, but the real storm was about to hit. Harland wouldn't see him coming. Jack's pulse quickened as he made his way back to his bike. His hands were steady as he straddled the Harley, but his mind was a whirlwind. The next chapter was about to unfold, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. He revved the engine, the deep growl of the Harley filling the empty night. Jack was ready. Ready to face Harland. Ready to find the girl. Ready to end this madness once and for all. Jack's hands tightened on the handlebars as the Harley roared down the empty highway. The night air was still, but the weight of the task ahead bore down on him like a storm that refused to pass. His mind kept replaying the man's words. Harland. The boss. The mastermind behind the cruelty the girl had suffered. Jack had known he was dealing with dangerous people, but the realization that he was chasing someone this untouchable, someone with this much power, sent a cold shiver down his spine. The warehouse was his next destination, the place where it all came together. He had no idea what he would find when he got there, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't turning back. The headlights of his motorcycle cut through the darkness, guiding him forward. As he neared the outskirts of town, the familiar landscape began to change. The streets grew emptier, the buildings taller, more industrial. The further he got, the more the air seemed to thicken. This wasn't just some criminal operation. It was a well-oiled machine, something far more dangerous than anything he had faced before. His pulse quickened as he pulled up to a narrow, unmarked street. He could see the warehouse ahead, an imposing structure that loomed like a fortress in the dark. It was exactly what he had expected, cold, calculating, and unwelcoming. There were no windows on the ground level, and the doors were large, industrial, meant to keep people out, or keep things in. Jack slowed the bike, his mind racing with the possibilities. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the urgency to find the girl, to end this madness, pushed him forward. He killed the engine and dismounted, his boots hitting the pavement with a soft thud. He kept low, scanning the area for any signs of life. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Jack moved carefully, his steps deliberate as he approached the back of the warehouse. He was good at moving unnoticed, a skill he had perfected over years of dealing with people who didn't like being followed. As he reached the corner of the building, he saw two figures standing near a door, talking in hushed voices. They weren't looking his way, but Jack knew better than to take chances. He crouched low, staying hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make his move. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. His heart raced, but he kept his breathing steady. This was it. He had come too far to screw this up now. After what felt like forever, the two men finally walked off in the other direction, disappearing into the darkness. Jack wasted no time. He moved swiftly, his body pressed against the cold, metal wall of the warehouse. He reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing the cool surface. It was locked, but that wasn't going to stop him. He pulled out a small set of tools from his jacket pocket and quickly got to work, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. The lock clicked open, and Jack pushed the door quietly, stepping inside. The interior of the warehouse was vast, filled with stacked crates and old machinery. The faint hum of a generator in the corner provided the only sound in the otherwise silent space. Jack took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he moved deeper into the warehouse, he noticed a faint light at the far end. It flickered intermittently, casting long shadows on the walls. Jack's instincts told him to be careful. The deeper he went, the more aware he became of the danger. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone. He stopped at the edge of the light and peered around the corner. What he saw made his stomach drop. The girl. She was sitting in the middle of the room, her hands bound once again, her eyes wide with fear. And standing in front of her, arms crossed, was the man, the boss. Harlan. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, but he stayed still, watching. Harlan's cold eyes scanned the room, but they didn't seem to notice Jack's presence. The boss was taller than Jack had imagined, his posture relaxed yet intimidating. There was an aura of control around him, something that made the air feel heavy. Jack's grip tightened around the knife at his side. He had come too far to turn back. The girl was close, so close he could almost reach her. But Harlan, he was the real threat. Jack had to move carefully. He couldn't risk a direct confrontation just yet. He needed to get closer, to find a way to get the girl out without alerting the boss. As Jack inched closer to the center of the room, he heard Harlan speak, his voice smooth and cold. "You're not leaving this place," Harlan said, his words directed at the girl. "You belong to me now." The girl didn't respond, but Jack could see the terror in her eyes. She wasn't just afraid of him. She was broken. Jack's blood boiled. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let her be trapped in this nightmare any longer. His mind raced as he looked around, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. There had to be a way to take Harlan down, to get the girl out. He wasn't going to fail her now. He had come this far. Jack was done being patient. He was done waiting for the right moment. He stepped into the light, his eyes locked onto Harlan. "Let her go," Jack growled, his voice low but full of authority. Harlan turned, his cold smile turning into a look of amusement. "And why would I do that?" he asked, taking a step toward Jack. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" Jack didn't back down. "She's not yours," he said, his voice unwavering. "And you're not going to get away with this." The tension in the room thickened, the air crackling with the promise of the fight to come. Jack knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he had no choice. He was going to end this, no matter what it took. Jack's heart pounded. In his chest, his every muscle coiled like a spring as Harlan took a step toward him. The tension between them was palpable, thick in the air, and Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had fought through hell to get here, to find the girl, to stop this nightmare. And now, standing face to face with the man who had orchestrated it all, Jack knew this was the final test. The girl was still sitting in the corner, her hands bound, but her eyes filled with something Jack hadn't seen in them before. Hope. A small spark, barely visible, but it was there. She was waiting for him to act. "You really think you can stop me?" Harlan sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just one man. You're nothing compared to what I've built." Jack didn't flinch. He had heard this kind of talk before. He had heard it from people who thought they were untouchable, people who thought they could control everything and everyone. But Jack knew better. "I'm not here to play your game," Jack said, his voice steady, cold. "I'm here to end it." Harlan's eyes flickered with a flash of anger, but it was quickly masked by a smug grin. "You really think you can walk away from this? You're too deep now. You're already in my world, and there's no way out." Jack's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. He wasn't going to let Harlan manipulate him any longer. He had been through too much, seen too much. The girl's suffering, his own past. None of it was going to matter if he didn't stop this now. "I'm done listening to your threats," Jack said, his voice low and controlled. "I'm taking her with me, and I'm going to make sure you can't hurt anyone else. Not ever again." Harlan's grin faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You're a fool," he hissed, his hand reaching for the gun at his waist. Jack's instincts kicked in. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the shot that rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet lodged in the wall behind him, sending a shower of dust into the air. Jack was already on his feet, his body moving like lightning. He was faster, sharper than Harlan, and he wasn't going to let him get the upper hand. Jack rushed toward him, grabbing Harlan's wrist before he could fire again. They struggled, the two men locked in a deadly dance, each trying to overpower the other. Jack could feel Harlan's strength, but he had something the man didn't: determination. The will to win, to protect. Harlan snarled as Jack twisted his arm, pushing him back against the crates with a force that made the older man grunt in pain. "You're not getting away," Jack growled, his voice laced with fury. With one last, desperate move, Jack shoved the gun out of Harlan's hand, sending it skittering across the floor. The two men stood face to face, panting, sweat dripping down their faces. Jack's eyes locked onto Harlan's, his heart pounding, but he didn't give an inch. "You don't have to do this," Harlan said, his voice suddenly calmer, almost pleading. "You have no idea what you're up against. You think you're saving her, but you're just a pawn. This is bigger than you." Jack took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. "It's not about me," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's about her, and I'm not letting you hurt anyone else." Harlan sneered, but it was clear that the fight was draining from him. Jack had him cornered, both physically and mentally. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Harlan spat, his eyes wild with desperation. "You can't stop me. You'll never stop me." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had heard enough. He was done with this man's threats. He stepped forward, grabbing Harlan by the collar and lifting him off the ground. "I don't need to stop everything," Jack said, his voice cold. "I just need to stop you." With that, Jack drove his fist into Harlan's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. The man gasped for air, his legs buckling as he collapsed to the ground. Jack stood over him, his body tense, every muscle ready to spring into action. But this time, he didn't need to. Harlan was done. The fight had left him. Jack turned, looking toward the girl in the corner. She was still there, watching him, her face a mix of fear and something else. Hope. Jack walked over to her, his steps steady, purposeful. He reached out his hand, offering it to her. She hesitated for a moment, but then, slowly she took it. "You're safe now," Jack said, his voice softer than it had been. He helped her to her feet, the weight of the moment settling in. The storm had passed, and the nightmare was finally over. But Jack knew this wasn't the end. Harlan might be defeated, but the road ahead was still uncertain. There would be more to face, more to fight for. But for now, they had won. Jack led the girl out of the warehouse, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. He was no longer running. He had found his purpose, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. They walked into the night, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack felt a sense of peace. The journey wasn't over, but they were finally free.